It's the CBT Nugget series for ITIL Foundations. I'm Chris Ward, and this nugget is on basic terminology. It's been said that every journey begins with a single step. However, I would add a caveat, and that is make sure that first step isn't off the cliff. We're not going to do that to you in this Foundations level ITIL exam nugget series. We're going to make sure that you understand some of the basic concepts and terminology that's going to be used throughout the entire ITIL framework, and we get started right now. To start us off in our journey to get you guys to the ITIL Foundations exam and to be successful, we need to make sure that we're all speaking the same language. It's really critical for us to apply concepts from the ITIL framework, and if we're not speaking the same language, it can be rather difficult, especially when you're sitting in a small lit room after spending a large amount of money to answer questions on a computer screen, and they say the word baseline, and you have one idea of what it is, but yet the ITIL framework utilizes it as a starting point to measure the effectiveness of a service improvement plan. And you're like, but that's not how I look at it. It's kind of like what I have right here in front of me. This is a 1962 Stingray, or the Corvette, made by Chevrolet, my favorite vehicle in all of the world. In fact, I'm hoping to get one just like this one, red and white. Ooh, yeah, soft top, great. But if you think about it, when we start talking about terminology, it's almost like, even though we speak the same language, like I speak English, but mine is an American English, and my friend Simon Lawrenson out there in Southampton, UK, speaks English, but it is the Queen's English, right? Well, here's the deal. If I'm talking to him on the phone or even on Skype, and I'm talking about how I just love the lines right here on the hood, just, it looks so great. And he's like, what are you talking about? That's called a bonnet. And I'm like, a bonnet? Isn't a bonnet what you put on your head? And he goes, well, isn't a hood what you put on your head? So we always laugh and kind of talk about it. Or back here, this is the trunk. That's what I call it. He says, no, this is the boot. And we obviously are still talking about the same thing, but we might be using different words. You have to have that commonality of your language. And when you are sitting in that small lit room, there's going to be a lot of questions that make sure that you, as a candidate, have a grasp of the terminology that's going to be used in those 5 books that we talked about, the 5 core books. So let's get started with an overview of some of the common terminology. And the good news is that as we go through each one of these other nuggets, when we hit a term that is something that you need to know, I'll make sure that I put a little star next to it or point out that, hey, you really need to know this term and what it means for that exam. I'm just going to be upfront and honest. As we go through these 5 books here, essentially, to give you the foundations for the framework, we're going to be covering everything from the service strategy all the way to continual service improvement, right? And in there are going to be some common terms that are utilized within the framework. Now, obviously, some of these terms you're going to see again in some of the nuggets, and there might be even some that I don't talk about here in this nugget that we'll cover later on. But let's start off with just a few here, including baselines. I mean, talk about one that really showcases the need to understand this. What is a baseline to you? If I ask a Microsoft guy, he's going to give me a definition. If I ask a Cisco guy, he might give me a slightly different exhibit of that, okay? But baselines here are going to be your starting points, or otherwise known as a reference point, and it is then used for looking back to or used to getting back to. Now, you can take many snapshots over time, but only a few are going to be used for baselines because that's where you start. We're not talking about what's happening in the middle. We're not talking about in the PMI vernacular milestones, right, that you're trying to get to. Now, there are a couple that you do need to know about. There is the ITSM baseline, and that is your starting point to measure how well your service improvement plan, or SIP, is going to do. You also have the configuration baseline. Now, your configuration baseline is very important because it's going to be used for another term that we'll talk about, and that is going to be used for remediation or backout the back out plan. And that means, if you think about it, if you are going to be doing a change to your IT service environment, or if you're going to do a release of something and it fails, you need to know where to go back to get your IT infrastructure back to where it needs to be. So it's something that's rather important. And then finally, the other one that they might talk about, I didn't see too much of, is the performance baseline. Now, it doesn't mean it's not important, but the performance baseline is going to be used to see what kind of change happens in the performance over the lifetime of an IT service. This is the performance that we were having on our response times at the service desk back when we started. And then once we did some service improvement, now we're at this level. So that's what the performance is. Now, business case, really, I just want you to remember, this is a planning tool, and it's all about justification of this, at least in the United States. Spending money. British pound, sterling pound, euro, the Japanese yen, whatever you want to talk about. It's the justification of spending money. And basically, this business case is a document. It's a planning tool, right? And it says, this is what's going to happen if we spend the money. Here are the costs, obviously. Here are the benefits. It's going to include stuff like, what is the risk of it? Potential problems. Okay? So you're going to have all of this as part of your business case. The next one is a fun one, and that is capabilities. And I want you to think about it this way. It is the ability, okay? So the capabilities, if you just keep in mind the word ability, and that can be anything from a person doing this, a process, an application. It could be one of those configuration items, the CIs that we'll talk about. And it is the ability to, important, to carry out activities. All right, that's the capabilities. Now, here's the interesting thing. Notice we've got function down here. Capabilities can include functions and processes. Okay, those are two things that are part of your capabilities, and that's the way that you help manage your services. Now, if you think about it, as someone once said, these are really sometimes considered intangible assets. You can't really purchase, but you develop them. So, for example, the ITSM set of organizational capabilities is all about enabling the effective and efficient delivery of services to customers, okay, according to the ITSM book that we have. Now, there is also functions. Now, here's the deal. Functions are going to be a team of people, important, all right, and the tools that they use to carry out processes, or sometimes called activities. Now, there are going to see in the ITIL functions that we talk about anyway, you're going to talk about the service desk. That's a big one, right? We're going to talk about that. There is the technical management. There is the application management. And finally, there is the IT operations management. And I won't put management there. So these are the typical, okay? These are the ITIL functions that we're going to talk about. And then, of course, we talk about IT service management. Now, IT service management, we talked about in the previous nugget. And just a reminder, this is specialized organizational capabilities, ding, 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 up here, that provide value to customers in the form of services. So basically, value to customers, and the way that they do that is through services, which makes sense, IT service management. Now, we talked about functions. Let's start talking about processes, right? Now, a process is basically some coordinated activities, and the whole goal is to produce an outcome that will then, these coordinated activities are going to have an outcome that provides this term again. We always see it, value. And we'll talk about the difference between, talk about warranty, and we're going to talk about utility and value and all those kind of things as well. But this is important for us to know. Now, the deal is that you will find that each process is going to have a process owner, but there are also process managers. Okay, now the owner is the person responsible for making sure that the process is doing what it's supposed to do, and is also, the owner is, ding, 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 small wetlet room, accountable. for that process. Okay? For example, there would be an owner for the availability management process, okay? And it makes sure that the outputs of that process work. Now, there are also managers, okay? Now, this is the person or a role, we would say, that's responsible for the operational management of a process. And there can be, obviously, maybe several managers for a particular process. And here's the thing, the manager reports to the owner. Okay, this is the person that's handling the operations of that process. The owner is the accountable one and making sure that it's doing everything it's supposed to be doing. But then there is the manager who's going to say, this is the operational management. This is what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. There are also, of course, resources. Now, resources can be anything from your IT infrastructure. It can be people. We need people. Those are resources. It can be money, and I'll just use the dollar because I'm an American and that's what we use. And it's still right now pretty much the predominant business item of value. And then, of course, there can be anything that is used to deliver the IT service. These are known as tangible assets, whereas your capabilities are considered intangible assets. Okay, that's the difference between resources and capabilities, one of the things to do. Then, of course, there is a service. This is literally the means to deliver value. It's the means to deliver value. And the way that it does that is to manage costs and risks from the service provider side while still maintaining the service to the end user or customer. So you're going to go from a provider to a customer. You have a service provider, and then you have a service customer. Now, if you look, and by the way, this is under the service strategy. We're going to talk about this when we get this. This is actually on page 13, so if you have the books and you want to refer to them, but I'll say it to you, and it'll be in the, obviously, transcript of this particular nugget. And I am also going to include a list of these items as a nugget lab. So if you have access to the nugget files in the nugget lab, depending on your access, you will also see some of these as well. But a service is the means of delivering value to customers by facilitating outcomes that the customers want to achieve without the ownership of specific costs or risks. And that's why, like I said, the costs and risks are over here on the provider, not for the customer. You're paying for that. A great example is I love coffee. Now, I can go out and buy my own coffee. I have a drip system, and I also have the new Chemex, filter system, and I can do that, and I can make myself coffee. Well, guess what? I pay all the costs. I have all the risks of the coffee not working right. Or I can go down to my local coffee store, and I can pay for the service of them providing me coffee. That's why it's important to know the difference between the providers and the customers. Finally, of course, if you're talking about a service, there is a service owner. This is the person that is responsible, for delivering. So you are the ones that are responsible for delivering the service. Okay? You are the ones that are responsible for delivering the service. They are also responsible for not only delivering the service, they are responsible for CSI, and no, not the television show. That is continual service improvement. Whoever owns the service should take ownership of it and say, I want to make sure that it gets better and better and better. And so when they ask you in the small room, well, who is in charge of continuous service improvement for a particular process, or service, we would say the service owner. Who is responsible for making sure that a process gets better? The process owner. Anytime you hear the word accountable or responsible, that is typically going to be the owner of a process or the owner of a service. So those are just a few of the basic common terms that you're going to see. We will touch on a few more throughout this Nugget series, like I said, and I will include a nice laundry list at the very end in the Nugget files when we're finished with this series that you'll be able to go back and check out, and you will want to know these. Again, in the exam environment, they do want to make sure that you understand what the framework is about, and when someone says something, you know and understand what it is they're trying to communicate to you. So there you go, some terms for you for the foundation level of the ITIL exam. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.